Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I just want to let you know we're going to wait about 4 to 5 more minutes to start. We're just waiting for a couple more people to join, and we will start shortly. Thanks so much for your patience. Hi again, everyone. I can see more people join, so I just want to let those of you who have joined know that we are going to start the webinar in about 2 more minutes. So thanks, everyone, for your patience. We'll start soon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Coordinated Community Response and Sexual Assault Response Team Training Opportunities. And this is sponsored by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, Tribal Judicial Institute, Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence, Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, as well as our direct service providers, Amonic Women's Shelter, Native Alliance Against Violence, the Oklahoma Coalition, and Domestic Violence Program of Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. Just a few housekeeping reminders. Your control panel will appear on your user screen. It should be on your right-hand side. All attendees will be muted during this presentation. And once you call into the meeting line, please enter your PIN number, and that way, at the end, if we have questions, we can unmute you. Feel free to ask questions in the panel box, and we will get to those questions at the end of the webinar. And during the discussion portion, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon. And just a friendly reminder that we have a survey going out at the end of the webinar. It should pop up when the webinar closes, and please take a few minutes to fill that out. It really helps us with future webinars and planning our information and technical assistance for folks. So we would appreciate it if you take a few minutes to fill that out. And with that, I will turn it over to Lana.
Thank you, Chia. My name is Lana Hunter, and I'm from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate Nation in Sisseton, South Dakota, and my father's people are from the Tlingit Nation in Southeast Alaska. And I work for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute as a Tribal Victim Resource Specialist, along with my colleague Bonnie Claremont, who will be presenting today on Coordinated Community Response and Sexual Assault Response Teams. We want to thank each and every one of you for being on the call today. We know that we have nations represented from across the United States all the way up to Alaska. So we welcome each and every one of you. We wanted to share information about the initiative that we're working on. We are funded through the Office on Violence Against Women. And so this is an OVW-funded initiative, and it's actually just a very new program, and it is offered to tribal governments, tribal communities that do not receive Office on Violence Against Women funding. And so that is a very important initiative, because as Native people, I think that we often think about those who are left out, and we try to share as much generosity and resources as possible. And so this goes along with our tribal values of thinking of those who may not be funded through OVW. So we can provide training and technical assistance to those tribes that are not funded by OVW. However, our webinars, the series that you're on now, is open to anybody who would like to join. But the training and technical assistance portion would be offered to those who are not funded by OVW. And so the upcoming webinar series that we have are in the areas that we offer training and technical assistance on. So we will have a webinar series next month in July that will focus on shelter and safe homes, either maintaining shelter and safe homes, or funding current shelter and safe homes. And we have in August a webinar focused on legal response to violence against Native women. And that could be from anywhere from tribal protection orders to how do we look at existing legal resources. And we'll cover a little bit of those resources today on our call. And we also have the Tribal Protection Order series that will be offered in September. So we'll focus on tribal protection orders, both enforcement, as well as issuing tribal protection orders and talking about within other jurisdictions within state and or federal enforcement. So that is a series that will be coming up in September. And then in October, we hope to offer a webinar focusing on domestic violence court, tribal courts, and that is a program that we offer through the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and so we'll be offering that in October. So those are existing series that we have coming up, and those are open to anyone who would like to join. So we have several partners, as Chia mentioned at the beginning, and we are currently working with the Tribal Judicial Institute, and they're located at the University of North Dakota. And we also work with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And part of that initiative is really to provide training and technical assistance that is Alaska specific. So many folks know that, when you are in Alaska, that many of our areas are very rural, but we also don't have a lot of the same programming that may be offered in the lower 48. And so for that reason, we've partnered with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And in addition, we also have the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence. There are 18 tribal coalitions located throughout the United States. And so this is the alliance that oversees and works with all of those 18 tribal coalitions. So we're happy to partner with them. The other partners that we have are direct service providers, and we wanted to ensure that we have expertise that is offered on the front lines working with victims. And so we have the Seminole Nation Domestic Violence Program from Seminole, Oklahoma. We also have the Amonic Women's Shelter located in Amonic, Alaska, and the Native Alliance Against Violence that has a shelter and domestic violence sexual assault program. So those are a few of our direct service providers. So that is our initiative, and I'll now turn it over to Bonnie Claremont, who is my colleague here at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, who will be presenting on CCRs and sexual assault response team.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar. And I am a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation, originally from Wisconsin, and I've been working for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute for about 15 years. Prior to coming to the Institute, I worked as an advocate for many years, as a domestic violence advocate and as a sexual assault advocate. And so what I'm presenting today is really within that context of the advocacy work that I did, along with the CCRs and the SARTs that I worked with and I helped develop. So it gave me a good foundation from which to do the current job that I do, is working with tribes that are developing CCRs and SARTs. So that's a little bit about my background. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And as Lana said, this initiative is really a unique one. It was developed by the Office on Violence Against Women, and their concern was for tribes that aren't currently receiving Office on Violence Against Women funding. And obviously, they know that they probably have issues with, of domestic violence and sexual assault and dating violence and stalking that's happening in their communities, and yet how are they addressing that with no OVW funding? So this initiative is really tasked with identifying those tribes that may need some training and technical assistance. So it is for tribes that aren't currently receiving OVW funding. And as we know, the rate of violence, we don't have real accurate data on the problem, on the issue. Some of the studies out there indicate that it is a huge problem in Indian country. On some reservations in the United States, the murder rate of Native women is 10 times higher than in the rest of the nation. 56.1% of American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced sexual violence, and 55.5% have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. And I suspect that those numbers are even higher than what's indicated in this data. Our research and data gathering resources are really limited, so I just don't believe that we have accurate data, because as we all know, either we've been impacted by domestic violence or sexual assault, or we know someone who has in our family, in our communities. And also an estimated 24.5% of American Indian Alaska Native women experience stalking during their lifetime. Oftentimes we see stalking along with domestic violence, for example, and dating violence. So we know that this is a problem, and yet we know that there are tribes. Perhaps some of you are on the call that from tribes that aren't currently receiving OVW funding, and yet this kind of data exists in your community. So I'm very thankful that you're able to receive these resources to help. So I wanted to just ask some questions, and if any of these, you answer yes to, then obviously there's a need for some assistance in the way of funding or in the way of training and technical assistance. So is your tribal community experiencing any of these common challenges when addressing domestic violence and sexual assault, such as lack of communication and coordination between agencies? Oftentimes we refer to this as siloing, like where agencies aren't really connecting and communicating and coordinating their efforts. They're sort of working independently, and and I really believe as Indian people, we're really good at coming together when we have some difficult times, right? When there's either natural disasters, or back in the day, when our, yes? Back in the day when our villages were under attack, we would come together to, we all had roles in terms of helping our community, protecting our community, and so forth. And so we know that that's traditional for us and how we work together on for the greater good of our community. You know, also for all those responding to domestic violence and sexual assault, is everyone aware of one another's resources? Are you aware of who's providing resources in your community? And are the people from your community accessing those resources? And also, are referrals being made across different agencies and jurisdictions? Is there a lack of cooperation between tribal and other jurisdictional authorities? You know, we all have resources and we all have the ability to respond and, you know, carry out our individual responsibilities in terms of domestic violence, sexual assault, for example. So is things like information sharing, is that going on? How is that information being shared? Are there some mutual agreements, some MOAs to do that, especially across other jurisdictional boundaries? So, you know, when we have major crimes, we have to rely on federal authorities for intervening in those, in the investigation and prosecution. So it's really important that agencies are able to work together across jurisdictional boundaries. Is there a lack of clear understanding about roles when responding to DV or SA? You know, does each agency know, you know, what other agencies do in terms of domestic violence, sexual assault cases? Are you aware of their limitations? Are you aware of their policies and protocols around their response? Is there a lack of offender accountability? Are defendants being charged? Are they being followed by probation? Are they, you know, violating orders, court orders, and not following through on what they're mandated to do, such as receiving treatment or refraining from further abuse and so forth? If not, then, you know, there's clearly a need for some intervention there. Are there gaps in the response to DVSA? Are cases or victims falling through the cracks, for example? Are victims being kept informed, or are they just sort of, they make a report and no one reconnects with them? Victims not reporting or distrusting criminal justice system, is that happening? And if so, how do you know that? Has there been any kind of you know, focus groups or receiving information from victims about the kind of response they receive from advocacy programs or law enforcement programs or from the courts or from medical facilities? If not, you know, that's another avenue that might be pursued, is to really get feedback from victims in terms of how they're being treated, because you want them to be able to trust the system that they might need to turn to for help if they're victimized. And also they're concerned about confidentiality and privacy and safety needs. You know, our communities, even though some reservations are really large, our communities are fairly small where people tend to know others. So again, you know, are victims being made aware of, you know, all the different rights that they have, the victim rights that they have? And because, you know, the confidentiality is so closely linked to safety, it's really incredibly important that, you know, each agency is aware of that any slightest slip of confidentiality or privacy could result in someone being harmed or even murdered. Are there culturally appropriate and insensitive treatment of victims of sexual assault or domestic violence? You know, if our people have to rely on non-Native organizations, are they receiving training in terms of their understanding about our cultural differences and the kinds of needs that Native victims may have that need to be met? Because that's another reason for victims not trusting the system and not trusting agencies, And if we want them to ultimately be able to report these crimes and to reduce crime rates and to hold offenders accountable, then we really need to be responsive to their needs. We need to have a victim-centered presence in our community so that victims can trust us. So when those reports are made, we'll be able to have their involvement, because without a victim, we have no case. We can't hold that offender accountable if that victim's uncooperative or afraid to work with the system. So if you answered yes to any of these, there's the likelihood that that we might be able to help if you don't receive OVW funding. So I want to talk a little bit about coordinated community response. CCR, we often, the use of acronyms. Well, CCR is, of course, the acronym for Coordinated Community Response, so I'll be using that in some of this. But it's a multi-agency collaboration, right? And I said that earlier, that as Indian people, that's how we do things. We pull together because not any one person or not any one family or not any one society or clan can solve the whole village's problem, right? We have to be able to come together and share what we have. So in an Indian way, we've done that. When something happens, we bring our resources, we bring our food, we bring our prayers, we bring our encouragement, we bring our, the wood for the fire, we bring whatever is needed to help what's happening in the community. So a CCR is no different than that when you think about it within that context. And it consists of individuals who respond to domestic violence incidents within a tribal community, who can be anyone from advocacy to law enforcement to the courts to medical people to probation to batterer intervention program people. And they coordinate and collaborate in order to develop and implement policies and procedures in terms of how they're going to operate and how they're going to collaborate with one another across agencies and across jurisdictions in order to establish culturally appropriate and victim-centered responses. Like I said earlier, that's so incredibly important. When someone's been traumatized and has experienced a really a serious violation, we want them to be able to reach out and get help. And if they're not receiving culturally appropriate victim-centered responses, then, they're probably not going to utilize the agency. So we want to look at things like where is the agency located? Where is that program located? Is it accessible? Do they provide, what are the hours of operation? And do they provide a culturally based response rather than maybe a behavioral health response, for example? We also want to ensure better accountability. Like I said, we don't want cases falling through the cracks and offenders violating protection orders and not being held accountable, for example. Each agency represented on the CCR play a vital role. Each person brings their skill sets to the circle and their passion to really create that victim-centered and victim safety in the community and also offender accountability. So everyone at the table is important. The advocates, the law enforcement, the judges, prosecutors, probation officers, and even beyond that. And I'll talk a little bit later about who else can be invited to the table. A sexual assault response team is very similar to a CCR. SART, again, that's the acronym. And it's a multidisciplinary interagency sexual assault intervention model. It's really a group of people, much like the CCR, who come together to share information about cases that they're seeing, how to strengthen their response to make it more victim-centered so that victims can trust the response and the services and that they're going to receive. And it's also instrumental in developing policies and practices to hold offenders accountable. So that, right from the whatever port of entry that this victim, enters the system, whether it's through the advocacy program or whether it's through the hospital or whether it's through law enforcement, that they're going to receive a victim-centered response, that it's not going to be victim blaming, that they're going to be given accurate information, good information, so they can make informed decisions, for example. And that should happen at every entry point where the victim enters the system. So that's another part of the work of a SART, is that everyone is on board with what that means to be victim-centered. And ultimately, in places where they've developed SARTs, they've seen an increase in reporting of sexual assault cases, and also an increase in charges and successful prosecutions. Because when you look at our commonality, it really is about creating community safety, safety for victims and healing, but also it has to do with offender accountability. We want to make sure that people who are committing crimes are being held accountable to what they need to do to no longer continue that behavior. Okay. So just a few words about the differences. They're very similar in nature. It's groups of people coming together around the table, meeting, however often they choose to meet, where they choose to meet. And I always encourage these teams to, think about where you're meeting even. There's nothing better than to move that around to maybe one-time meeting at the advocacy offices, or maybe one-time meeting at the law enforcement offices, or even the prosecutor's office, because it really makes a statement to those agencies that you're working together around this common effort. So the commonalities, the CCR is much more focused on domestic violence as opposed to the SART. They're much more focused on sexual assault response and improving that. The CCR is a little bit more focused on the civil legal end of things in terms of protection orders, enforcing protection orders, the other needs of the battered woman in terms of custody, keeping the offender away from her for a period of time, making sure she has a safe place to be, working with the advocates, and also any other additional needs that she has in terms of from a civil legal perspective. And also to under the SART, it's a little bit more of a criminal legal focus, where you have a group of people who are looking at a victim who's filed a criminal complaint against the offender, and then from there that sets in motion the investigation and the prosecutor's office making some determinations about if they're going to charge the case as a major crime, a felony. And then that, again, leads into additional hearings and so forth. They both, and it can cross over. Civil legal can, a CCR can also perhaps look at some of the criminal elements of what happens, especially if there's violations of protection orders, as well as the SARTs may even include looking at civil legal. If we have a rape victim who's been raped by her partner, for example, she may need some civil legal help. So under the CCR, they're, again, under the SART, they share information, and they also have strict confidentiality regulations around that. So tribes are looking at developing confidentiality policies for case review, for example, within their teams. How do they do that, and what information does the victim have a right to know about the information that's being shared about them? Creating victim-centered responses with victim safety is a high priority. Asking all those questions about, how does victims access services? Is that safe for the victim? If not, how can we make it safer? Offender accountability focus also is a primary element of both teams, a CCR and a SART. Again, what was the crime, and what did it entail, and what kind of treatment is needed, and having the batterer intervention folks be also at the table under the CCR. One of the things that we're lacking is sex offender treatment under sexual assault response teams. We need more culturally appropriate sex offender treatments. And that's a huge missing piece, but there's a lot more people that are focusing on that. Really the importance of offender accountability is to make sure that offenders don't continue to commit the same kind of crimes, because, that's just, harmful to the family, to the individual, and the community. So we want that to stop. Stakeholders, can be anyone that the team feels needs to be at the table. It could include tribal leadership. It could include, healers, traditional healers, and so forth. It's really up to the team to make those determinations. Which brings us to the question of who should participate on either a SART or a CCR. Like I've been saying, they're very similar in nature. Under a CCR, law enforcement, and that could be either tribal or BIA or local, and also an advocate, someone from the advocacy program, someone from probation, to ensure that whatever kind of court orders that are handed down, that the offender is not violating those orders, that they're maintaining that, and if not, then probation needs to report back to the courts that there's been a violation of those orders, so that everything is really transparent as far as keeping that offender, holding that person accountable. In some communities, there are batter intervention programs for batters to understand better why battering happens, why he's chosen to be violent, because it really is a choice. This batter has made a choice to be violent, and the batter intervention program or re-education programs helps that person to understand why they've battered, and to start to look at how do they change that behavior, what are the alternatives to battering in terms of expressing anger and so forth. So it also involves the courts. All the court personnel should be informed and aware of the CCR and the role of the CCR, and also to help the CCRs to help the courts be a safer place for battered women. So where can they wait, for example, until their case is going to be heard? Is there a safe place so that they don't have to be encounter the batterer? And prosecution should be also at the table with the CCR to look at, if there are violations and if there needs to be a criminal process, then prosecution should also be at the table in the CCR. And like I said before, the SART is very similar. Law enforcement should be involved. If it's under federal jurisdiction, then you probably would want someone from the FBI's office or from the victim witness office of the FBI, and also any local law enforcement, perhaps, because they may be the ones to be the first responders on the scene, or BIA law enforcement or tribal law enforcement. So all of these agencies, depending on the jurisdiction of the tribe, should be at the table so that there can be that cohesive response when sexual assault happens. Someone or some, advocates from local advocacy programs, the sexual assault forensic examiner's office should be there, the health professional, where the forensic examinations are held, but there's also on that continuum, victims may also need, health care for injuries that they've sustained, or ongoing treatment for sexually transmitted infections or pregnancy or abortion. The prosecutor's office, if there are charges that are going to be filed, that they also need to be at the table to help the rest of the team to look at how does that happen when they receive a case, how do they make that determination to charge a case, who does that, and what's the process, who informs the victim, and so forth. So going back to the advocate, their role is really, they wear many hats. They're there to provide emotional support for the victim. They're there to provide accompaniment while the victim is receiving a forensic examination. If there are charges that are being filed, they're there to accompany the victim through that process, that criminal process. And also to work with the other service providers, the other responders, to make sure that, you know, their response continues to be victim-centered and that everyone is keeping the victim informed and involved. And other professionals that the team feels that would be appropriate, as well as on the CCR, other professionals or even traditional healers may be invited to the table, because oftentimes, you know, if someone who's been sexually assaulted wants to really strengthen their healing journey, they may, you know, a traditional healer at the table would be really important and helpful. Want to make sure that healer doesn't have their own issues regarding their perspective on why sexual assault happens, why domestic violence happens. So again, you know, to ensure that that person is a safe person for victims to work with. I'm going to talk briefly about the benefits, and I've mentioned many of them already. It really helps agencies to come together, because oftentimes we think we know what other agencies are doing, but unless we sit down and share that information, sometimes we're surprised to know, gosh, I didn't know you did that, or it's really good to know that you do that. It also establishes that cross-jurisdiction cooperation that we so vitally need, because there are some cases at a criminal level that tribes don't have authority over. So we do need our partners across jurisdictions to come work with us at the table. And sometimes that can be a little challenging, because those partners that are outside of tribal jurisdictions may already be participating on a SART, for example, or already on a CCR, and they feel like maybe joining us on our tribal SART is a duplication of efforts, but it really isn't. A tribal SART in a community is very different than a SART that's operating in mainstream, for example. So that kind of cooperation and collaboration is really important. Protocols. This gives us an opportunity for, you know, within a team to develop response protocols. Like I said, at every place that a victim enters the system, you know, that response needs to be really victim-centered and the same, so that there are no surprises. We know that if a victim makes a report or contacts law enforcement, we know that they're going to provide a victim-centered response, that no one's going to blame the victim for what happened or shame that person for what happened, and is going to provide, you know, a sensitive, compassionate response. We also should all be aware of the team's confidentiality policies and how incredibly important those are. So those should be developed by the team, by the CCR, so everyone is aware of what that is, and that they also sign agreements to this confidentiality policy. Roles and responsibilities are often defined by the protocols, for example, so that each agency, each discipline can share their role with other agencies at the table, so that everyone is clear about the roles that each agency brings to the SART or the CCR. And really, it's about developing victim-centered responses, again, so that victims can ultimately, you know, trust the response they're going to receive. It also can involve training. You know, there's always such a need for training, and this is an opportunity for SARTs, tribal SARTs, and CCRs to bring in people to provide training and technical assistance to help them. And one of the things that I know I've done for tribes is map the existing response. You know, draw a visual to say, okay, so a victim enters the system through this doorway. What happens there? What kind of services are provided there? And if they don't provide all the services that victim needs, where do they go next? So that we do that mapping exercises with tribes to help them look, you know, really closely at what currently exists and what are the gaps. Along with this, I firmly believe that that there's a need for community education and awareness. And the SARTs that I've helped develop, I really encourage them to go out in the community and provide community education and awareness as a team. For example, maybe a law enforcement person go out with an advocate and do a community forum around sexual assault response or around the existence of this CCR, this SART that's been developed. So the community knows that this team exists, but also they see that presence of advocate working with law enforcement. You know, that's going to, again, reinforce the trust that needs to happen for victims. And that we all share the focus of offender accountability, right? We want to hold people that commit crimes accountable to the crime that they've committed and to maybe even work towards repairing the harm that they've committed and really taking personal responsibility for the crime that the violence they chose to utilize in that crime. So that's a commonality that is shared at the table among the team members. Okay. This is just one example. It's a protocol development process. It's one that we've utilized or I've utilized in training, and my first exposure to this was in our local sexual assault response team in the county here in St. Paul, Minnesota. This is the cycle that we used, and it starts with looking at what kind of services currently exist where in this case, it's sexual assault victims. Where do they go for services? So we did a community-wide survey of all existing services, including all the different law enforcement agencies, the prosecutor's office, all the medical places where someone would go to get a forensic examination. And in that information of all these agencies, we included the name of the organization, their address, their phone number, if they have a website, and then a listing of their services, their hours, if they have a fee for their services. So any kind of services where a sexual assault victim may go was included in this survey. We took that information and we did a resource directory of services for victims of sexual assault. We also wanted to know about what are victims currently experiencing when they report their assaults to law enforcement, for example, or when they, seek help at the local emergency room, or when they go to the advocacy program. So, again, we asked for feedback from victims because we wanted to look at what are victims experiencing right now, and how can this team address those issues. And then we did a community needs assessment. We held a series of focus groups around the community just to hear what they had to say about the issue of sexual assault in general, but also the kind of response that they get when, that they're hearing about and victims seek help. Once we receive all that, we start to write our individual protocols within law enforcement. We use our existing protocols, but we also look at the possibility of improving our protocols. So once that's all done, they're formally accepted by the team. Each agency has to take the protocol that's been written back to their department heads and so forth to have it all approved. Once that's all done, everyone signs on that we're going to adhere to these protocols. There's sort of a MOAs that's done that we're going to participate on this team, and we all contributed to the protocols that were established. And within that protocol are policies like confidentiality policies and so forth. So it's kind of that guidebook that guides this team, and everyone agrees to it by signing on this MOA. And everyone receives training as to the roles, the responsibilities, the protocols, the policies around confidentiality, and so forth. All while that's happening, we monitor how this is all going. We may also do another victim experience survey somewhere down the line to see if all of this has helped improve the response that victims are receiving. And then an evaluation component, evaluating the response, and also evaluating this process of the 8-step model. So there's a two-prong approach to the evaluation. And that information can be really useful if someone is looking to seek funding, for example. They then have a basis to say, this is what we've been doing, and these are the results that we are seeing. And that could really provide a strong information for a proposal for funding. Okay. A few more benefits of a tribal sexual assault response team, a SART. It really conveys that there's people that are really concerned about this issue that have come together as a collective, as a working group. And it really sends a strong message that sexual violence is intolerable and that offenders will be held accountable to the fullest measure of the law, that no one is above the law regardless of who it might be. And it also maximizes oftentimes the limited resources that we have in tribal communities, and we're really good at doing that, right? Sometimes we've come through times where we're kind of real poor, but somehow or another we manage to get through those times, and some of that is just being really creative by sharing resources with one another. And again, that's really the essence of SART and CCR development, is really coming together and sharing our resources and maximizing that that information and also the communication and cooperation. It makes our jobs so much easier, right? And why would anyone not want to be a part of that? It also provides a roadmap, so it really sort of reduces the possibility that there's confusion about the kind of services that are available, and also to help us look at the gaps and also to strengthen, our victim-centered services and responses from each agency and discipline. And it also restores hope in the community that there's people on board, there's leaders, there's service providers that are making concerted efforts to respond to this crime in a real culturally appropriate way, one that's really based in tribal traditions. And often that's reflected in a SART or a CCR's mission statement, or their vision or their philosophy statement, so that's sort of their guiding principle of the team. So our next question is, does your community need assistance with improving response to domestic violence and sexual assault? And for all those that aren't currently receiving OVW funding, we hope that the answer would be yes, because we are here ready to help in every way that we can. So this is what we can do. And this is, for me individually, this is one of my passions. I love doing on-site training. I love working with groups of people who have a shared vision, that really have a desire to create and improve existing services and what's there in the community. And sometimes they want to do that because they themselves have been, maybe have experienced these crimes. They maybe have experienced domestic violence, or they may have experienced sexual assault, or they have a family member, a daughter who's experienced this. And they really want to see improvements in the system. And one way that can happen is through a CCR or a SART. And when you bring those groups of people together, it's like magic happens. You see the light bulbs going on. And just one quick example, I went down to Macy, Nebraska one year, many years ago. It was probably about 15 years ago. And there's a group of women who came together. And this is really what they wanted to do, was form a team. And it was really a group of elderly women. So when you look at who are your stakeholders, think outside of the box, right? Think about who you want in the circle. And sometimes that could mean women like that, Auntie Alice who makes a good pot of soup and fry bread, or, those, don't eliminate those possibilities, because they too have things that they can share, information and wisdom. that they can bring to the team. So this is, we can provide that, again, like we said, for tribes that aren't currently receiving OVW funding. We are here to help you with planning, engagement, how to engage your tribal leadership, for example, how to engage other, your partners at the table that are needed there from other jurisdictions. How can you just achieve that stakeholder buy-in in order to develop a team? And also we work with those teams to start the process of developing protocols. And we do that in a number of ways. We have examples of other tribes and their protocols, if any of those look like that might, fit with you. But we also don't necessarily want you to just take it and rubber stamp it, right? Some of the work that's being done by teams is really beneficial by sitting down and talking with one another and visiting with one another and sharing your concerns or sharing the challenges that you're experiencing when in the course of the work that you do. So we also want this to be effective for you. So that should all be considered in the process of protocol development. And also implementing the team. Those are all questions. There's specific questions that I ask in terms of, who should be at the table or who should be the responder. If a victim arrives at the emergency room, who should be called? Who's going to call those individuals? Not just the emergency room will call the advocate. It's got to be more specific than that. Who in the emergency room should call an advocate? Who's going to call law enforcement if that victim wants to make a report? So the actual implementation is kind of like it's a step-by-step process. And evaluation is also important. Again, we want to keep track of what we're doing. Is it effective? Where are the gaps? We need to, just document those gaps as we see them, and how can we fill those gaps and improve them. And then looking at sustainability. Sometimes we look at sustainability with just money, in our minds, and it goes beyond that to look at, what's the driving force? What's the glue that keeps this team together, and how can it still be there even after the funding is over? And then also the training, a lot of these efforts are led by the advocacy programs. So if you have no advocates, this might be a good place to start, is to look at maybe having volunteers come on board. And, if they want some advocacy training, that's something that we might be able to provide as well. And there's other agencies that also provide victim advocacy training, other TA providers. And again, like I said before, community education and awareness is so incredibly important, because you want your stakeholders to understand clearly why domestic violence, sexual assault happens, and also to help them understand that you're working together as a team to address those issues. So very quickly, we can come to the community to do on-site training, to work with an existing core group. Oftentimes in communities, it's a small group of people who've come together, maybe 2 or 3, 4, 5 people that have come together to say, yes, we want to form a team. We also can provide resources to help guide your team. So it's not always just on-site training, but we have a lot of resources that are available. We can walk through the steps of forming a team. Like I said before, we can help you develop a mission statement. Looking at who should be invited to the team, to the table. We can help you brainstorm around that. Looking at troubleshooting existing problems regarding the response to domestic violence or sexual assault, and how a team can resolve those problems. So these are just some of the things that we can do, as well as helping you through that protocol development process, and especially around confidentiality and how to work across disciplines. And also, we have lots of examples of MOUs and so forth if you need those. So I'm going to turn it over to Lana to wrap it up, to share information with you about our services.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your long time advocacy services. I think for many of the folks on the phone, you know, when we talk about advocacy, we really mean that really victim-centered advocacy approach. And so in that, you know, we approach all of our work with victim safety as the first and prime, you know, foremost is looking at a victim safety. So I just love that Bonnie shares the advocacy perspective from that victim-centered approach. So thank you so much. So we have just some critical questions to answer before we go and just share some quick resources with you. And then we want to have just a little bit of time to answer any questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box, and Chia will assist us in doing that. And we thank you for hanging in there with us. We had to start a little bit late, so we might just go over a couple minutes. So what is the cost for training? That is the probably most asked question that we get. And just a reminder that there is no cost for any tribe or tribal community that does not receive Office on Violence Against Women funding. So you can send us an email and we'll have some of that information at the end, or visit our website, which is the tribal resources, tribalresponse.org, and you can see that on your screen. So all of the information that Bonnie presented today, you can find under the tab Coordinated Community Response. But we have resources for victim safety planning. We have resources for advocacy, systems advocacy, community-based advocacy. We have legal resource information, tribal protection order information, and probably the first, our prime area we have, you can request training and technical assistance. So on the next slide, we have an example of what one of our pages would look like, the Coordinated Community Response, which Bonnie just presented on. There are some samples there from other training and technical assistance providers, as well as information about how to set up a CCR. All of the resources that Bonnie mentioned today around sexual assault response teams are also on there. So please feel free to visit our website. A few of the resources that we have available are listed here, but around legal code development and domestic violence, there is different information that highlights the domestic violence laws, how to set them up. Also, the tribal laws implementing Tribal Law and Order Act and Violence Against Women Act from 2013, which includes the special domestic violence criminal prosecution or jurisdiction. We also have information on domestic violence case law for those attorneys or for those who want to learn more about what case law is available in tribal communities. These are all available at www.home.tlpi.org. We also have resources around sexual assault response teams. We have information around sexual assault, how to draft sexual assault and stalking laws, information around tribal law enforcement, prosecutor protocol resources, and then tribal sexual assault response teams, as Bonnie spoke of today. So these are all available on our website or on our TLPI website. We also have information just around domestic violence resources. Listening to Our Grandmothers is a series that was set up around our historical laws around tribal communities, how we responded historically to domestic violence in our communities, sharing our stories of survival. This information is available for legal advocates, for prosecutors to understand and learn more about the stories of how many survivors have come to terms of justice, how they have arrived at different areas and sharing their own personal stories. We also have the Tribal Domestic Violence Courts handout, so you can download that from our website as well. And then we have emerging issues around domestic violence courts, prosecution. So these resources are available on our website or on our TLPI website. So we have just a few moments for some questions. So if you have any questions, I'll turn it over to Chia to assist us with this process.
Thanks, Lana. I we have a few questions. Oh, sorry. We have a few questions here. Let's see. Sorry. Usually I can get this to. Okay. Someone has a question. Is there a SART response team in our region? I live in the hub of Bethel, Alaska.
That is a great question. So I know that when I was working at the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, we set up 22 sexual assault response teams and 22 emergency rooms throughout Alaska. And I know that we did work with the local clinic in Bethel. However, that was back in 1998. So it'd be worth contacting the Bethel Community Clinic or the local domestic violence shelter there in Bethel to request that information.
Thanks, Lana. We have another question here. How can a team include a victim survivor as a stakeholder or decision-making member?
That's an excellent question. I think there are those that have been more recently sexually assaulted, and I really believe in empowerment to really bring in the voice of victims wherever we can. But again, it really is important that victims know that they're ready to do this, because I think, their information, their experience can really lend a lot of information to the work that SARTs do. But we also want to avoid any re-traumatization for people. So it's really important to be able to have that discussion with them, to visit with them, to see why they want to do this. Are they ready? And then, of course, if they join and feel like they're not, they're totally okay to change their minds and not do so. So I totally agree with, really providing some kind of platform or another so that victims, that we have their voice at the table when we can.
Thanks, Bonnie. Another question. How can your TA guide intersectional approaches to include two-spirit queer relatives?
I think, we have worked probably in the movement for probably Bonnie and I together a total of 50 years. And I think that, just recently we have begun to understand the very unique needs for our LGBTQ two-spirit communities. I believe that, within our tribal nations, many of us had beliefs around understanding that many of them were medicine people or medicine men, and so holding them in high regard. I think at least the first step is to educate our communities, educate our programming around the understanding, and to challenge any homophobic, notions or ideas. I think that's a great place to start to educate our communities. And as far as bringing it into our communities, I would encourage many of our folks to find those from the two-spirit community to join our boards, to join our sexual assault response teams, to join our CCRs, our coordinated community response, so that we have their voice included in all of the work that we continue to do. And, even better is to employ those from the two-spirit community to be advocates, to respond to sexual assaults, to respond to domestic violence incidents, and to understand how we can create that safe space for them. Because oftentimes, even in our own tribal communities, we have to challenge homophobia. So I would just encourage you to go directly to your community members who identify as two-spirit, and if they have any interest or understanding or want to participate in any capacity, that is a great first step.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Another question. How can this team also include our formerly incarcerated relatives?
Oh, I so love that question.
Yeah.
Both Lana and I, Lana and I have a lot of compassion and really commitment to empowering and bringing our sisters and relatives who've been incarcerated back into the community and find a place for them to come back, to enter back into the circle. I think that in where they come from, they've experienced, again, probably some more victimization and more trauma. And, where we try to be a presence there within those walls to bring healing and understanding and empowerment and caring. And that journey back into our communities needs to be a safe one, that they need to be brought back in a good way. Because they've paid their price. But again, some of the things that they've experienced while being incarcerated, I think we also need to look at those and what's happening right now in those systems to make sure that our relatives are being treated well, that they're not being, again, being re-victimized behind the walls, because I still hear those stories, and they're pretty sad, So again, yes, I would hope that these teams look at, number one, what's currently happening in their community with people who are institutionalized like that are held, behind bars, and look at those places as being safe, and then also how we can include that, have that dialogue within our teams to include the voices of those who've been incarcerated.
Thank you. Another question, how can we include our unsheltered relatives?
Can we get a little more clarity to that question? Is it our homeless relatives or those who are not in domestic violence or shelters or safe homes, or both?
AKA homeless transient population.
I think that's a great question. I know that working even in the migrant communities, and those are our indigenous relatives, many of those are migrant workers, and so they move from place to place. And so oftentimes, transient folks don't have a safe home shelter to go to. Many of them face addictions or substance use disorders. I think that, as we begin to address those populations, especially our Native youth, many of them fall victims to trafficking, sex trafficking, or human trafficking. I think that they're at a huge risk when they are homeless or transient, and they face a lot more potential victimization, just by the mere fact that they do not have a safe place or a safe home to go to. So I think part of it is to understand, what are that population of services that we can offer. How can we have victim advocates, either visiting local shelters or locations where, we can ask about safety in a way that, we can hopefully provide some services to them. But it is a very difficult population to try to reach. And so that really depends on your jurisdiction, your area, and what services you have available for them, because ultimately if you reach out to folks, you want to be able to place them somewhere. And so what that really looks at, what the capacity that you have within your community. I know that there have been some tribal programs that have started homeless shelters specifically for men, specifically for women and or families. So I think that, as we look at developing, either homeless shelter or some place for them to arrive at safety, that we really look at the potential to separate, the men and women and also have a place for families. Because I think that, maybe folks don't want to identify as a victim, but understanding that they may have faced victimization, and that may be why they are homeless, or trying to understand more of their circumstances.
Thank you, Lana. Another question, how can a tribal member find out if their tribe receives OVW funding?
Well, if you would like to send us an email at tribalresponse@tlpi.org, or on the next slide, we have our information personally. Lana Hunter in Bonnie Claremont, you can send us an email and we'd be happy to inquire. Working directly with OVW, they are able to provide us information about your tribe and or location, so feel free to reach out to us.
Thanks, Lana. Another question. Who is the community that can attend the training, and where is the training?
That's a great question. So this initiative began about 18 months ago, really just planning and looking at how many tribes in the United States, including Alaska, do not receive federal funding, and we estimate about 80% of the tribes to not receive OVW funding. So for that reason, there is a large area. 80% of our tribes is probably around 400 or so that do not receive OVW funding. So currently we are taking requests either through our website or calling us or emailing us directly. And so we want to understand more about your training needs, because we are only able to provide training within CCRs, or coordinated community response teams, sexual assault response teams, legal response as they pertain to tribal protection orders, and shelter and safe homes. So because we're limited to those areas, does not mean that we cannot provide you written information about other areas that you're inquiring about, or to refer you to another program or training technical assistance provider. But for this beginning of this programming, we are looking at where those trainings can be held, and that really depends on where those requests come from. So right now we do not have a scheduled training. We are working with several tribes and programs around the state, around the United States, to identify where those training needs are. But if you have a specific request, please contact us, and we would love to try to figure out how we can assist you, and hopefully, if your tribe qualifies, to host a training for your tribe, as well as maybe other tribes in the area.
Thank you, Lana. We have one final question, which are there any current tribal DV courts utilizing pet or dog therapy in the courtroom? And I can answer that one. And I just want, not that we know of. There are very few tribal DV courts right now across the U.S., and those that we have talked to, I don't believe are utilizing any type of pet or dog therapy. And that is it. We don't have any other questions.
Thank you, Chia. Thank you, Bonnie. And thank you to all our participants. And feel free to reach out to us. On the last page is our email address, as well as our website. You can request training and technical assistance through there, or contacting us directly. And we would love to hear from you. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Chia. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you. I think that I just line up.